anything that they'd like to. Oh, Marianne, sneaking ahead and light 2 final candles. One for those of you who kept your joys and concerns in your heart, and one for those who are still in harm's way in the world. So as a segue into our homily, we have a little responsive reading. And I'll read the regular text, and then you all will read the text in all capital letters. Would somebody be interested in volunteering to unmute themselves to read the text in all capital letters, just so we have a few more voices besides my own?
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks, Jenny. So I'll read the regular text and you'll read the text in all capitals along with Jenny. All living substance, all substance of energy, being, and purpose are united and share the same destiny.
All people, those we love and those we know not of, are united and share the same destiny.
Birth to death, we share this unity with the sun, earth.
Our brothers and sisters, strangers.
Flowers of the field, snowflakes, volcanoes, and moonbeams.
Birth, life, death, unknown, known, unknown.
Our destiny from unknown to unknown.
May we have the faith to accept this mystery and build upon its everlasting truth.
Thanks, Jenny. So today's homily is heavily visual. So Jordan's kindly gonna move us through some slides to show some examples of what it is that I'm talking about. But it also talks a lot about doodling and labyrinths and mazes, and is very much about using doodling or the path of the labyrinth as kind of a meditative tool to open us up into other spaces. So the order of service has an example of a labyrinth whose path you can trace if you want during the service. But I also just wanted to give people permission and encourage folks that if any point in seeing different examples or ideas around these different doodles, you feel compelled to give them a try as you're listening, that is encouraged. You should just invite a spirit of play and trust that what you're meant to hear, you'll hear while you're doodling, and that we're just kind of having an experience together. So be a kid and don't feel bad if the doodling ends up being what you want to pay attention to, not all the words that I'm saying. All right, with that, we'll dive in. When I started keeping a writing notebook, I assumed the words I wrote down each day would eventually tell me something. Bound by leather and line, I thought I'd be able to track my thoughts, interests, and experiences. Over time, a story would emerge about the significance of all those times I'd skinny dipped. I'd understand the arrival in my body. I'd make sense of my constant quest for vocation and meaningful work. Now, I suppose the 15 or so notebooks I filled with words over the last 5 years could help me craft a story. But to be honest, I find when I read them that any narrative is still disjointed, the pattern yet to be found. It doesn't seem like I've gone anywhere, just double backed on the same themes time and time again. Instead, when I flip through their pages, what I notice has changed are the doodles. Labyrinths are an ancient archetype that consist of a single pathway that repeatedly loops back on itself to reach the center of the form before winding along the same pathway back to the outer edge. Unlike a maze, the pathway is unicursal. It follows a single line without intersections or dead ends. Whereas a maze has junctions and trickery that require puzzling and conscious choice about the right path, a labyrinth allows one to suspend the left side of their brain that governs rational, logical, and linear thinking, and instead open into a non-rational and intuitive space. As an undergraduate who diligently completed and took notes on reading assignments, I often found myself bored during class lectures that reiterated what had first been presented in the textbook. Needing something to occupy some of my mental bandwidth, but that didn't distract from listening to the lecture, I developed a practice of circle doodling. The practice evolved from a moment during a science and society lecture where I found myself idly drawing spirals in the margin of my notes, soothed by the circular coiled path. At the time, I spent a good deal of time in the ceramic studio listening to my professor Wayne philosophize about art. Wayne, like many artists, was a character full of contradictions and idiosyncrasies. He insisted that he did not have OCD, but OCTs, obsessive compulsive tendencies that helped, not hindered his life. And despite applying that compulsive attention to glazed chemistry and the incredibly intricate patterns that he would wax onto pots, his motivation as a ceramicist was entirely utilitarian. He made forms, mugs, bowls, and plates to be used and saw them not so much as art, but as inventory and income to buy paper, brushes, and watercolors. Clay was a means to an end. For him, it was his identity as a painter, not a ceramicist, that made him an artist. The crux of every single one of Wayne's paintings, which Jordan's going to display for us now, is the shape of a seed divided in, when Jordan shared his screen, it made my script go away. Okay. The crux of every single one of Wayne's paintings is the shape of a seed divided in half vertically from point to point. The two sides of the shape are shaded in contrasting colors, the divided seed always accompanied with a pear bound by a box. Repeated hundreds or thousands of times throughout a painting or an image, an image or scene emerges from the tiled mosaic. Jordan, if you want to go to the next slide, then you can kind of see an example of how it works. When I asked Wayne about how he developed this style, he said, "I was teaching high school art. I could never sit down and paint without interruption. I needed something that I could do a little bit at a time and feel like I made progress. I thought of each box, each pair of seeds as its own painting. If I got one box done, I'd painted that day." Inspired by this and the comfort of the feel of those tight coils, I first picked the circle as my shape. Not particularly talented as a visual artist, I took on simple tools, a blank page and a black pen. Jordan, if you want to go to the next slide. I drew hundreds of circles and repeated them the same internal pattern of line over and over again until the page was filled like a slide of cells under a microscope. My task was to see just how many different ways I could use circles, lines, and dots to create different patterns. They were never about product, but about process. What could emerge from constraint, the balance of black and white, and the focus and flow I felt when making them. Labyrinths have appeared throughout history and cultures. The 7-circuit classical design, which appears on the next slide, if I can keep track of my own slides, appears etched into rock as early as 25,000 to 2000 BCE in a tomb in Sardinia. Archaeologists theorize that its presence in the tomb connects the labyrinths to rituals of life and death, and note the hooked shape at the center, similar to the crook of the shepherd's staff that suggests we are guided through life. This same pattern and pathway appears again through one of the most famous ancient labyrinths of Knossos, dated to 12,000 BCE. Myth says the labyrinth was built by Daedalus to house the Minotaur ultimately killed by Theseus. Although this labyrinth was not ever found when the site was excavated by Arthur Evans in the early 20th century, coins from Crete show both round and square versions of the classical design. Labyrinth designs were then taken up and expanded by the Romans from 165 BCE to 400 CE. If you go to the next slide, I think that there's an example. Oh, sorry. They're out of order. If you can go ahead, you guys are getting a preview. Yeah, the Roman labyrinth, here we go. The Roman labyrinth loosely imposed the classical labyrinth as the basis for the 4 quadrants of a longer path. Navigating a Roman labyrinth requires the travel to move through each quadrant sequentially before reaching the center, which often had an image of Theseus and the Minotaur at its core, suggesting that at our core we must face our inner demons. In more recent history, the classical design has also appeared in Native American traditions. The cross at the center is said to denote the 4 directions. Labyrinth iconography is particularly strong in Hopi cultures, first appearing in the 12th century and existing today on the license plates of reservation vehicles. The labyrinth is a symbol of emergence or birth and creation and is known as Mother Earth. Interestingly, in Hopi culture, the labyrinth appears again as it did in Crete, with both squared and rounded boundaries. The squared version represents mother and child, whose squared pathway lines simultaneously suggest the baby curled in the womb and the newborn infant cradled in loving arms. The rounded version symbolizes Father-Son and his constant presence and offering as we journey through life. Historians report that the labyrinths reached their peak when used as a spiritual tool for pilgrims and practitioners to walk through the late 15th century. In fact, church labyrinths built during the medieval period make up their own category. Their design was considered a breakthrough from Roman-style labyrinths. With 11 circuits as opposed to 7, church labyrinth's circuitous path meandered through all 4 coordinates as opposed to each one sequentially, to create the feeling of not knowing where the path went next. Although almost all medieval cathedrals housed labyrinths, most were destroyed in the 18th and 19th centuries. At this time, garden mazes that puzzled the mind became popular. It is thought that this, along with the arrival of the Age of Reason that emphasized linear thinking, made the circuitous path of the labyrinth seem out of place. Now, I have found when given lines, I tend to conform to them. After college, the early and middle years of my 20s followed a linear paradigm. I worked within boxes, the empirical framework of science whose method, based on null hypothesis, seeks truth through disproval, the process of elimination. Then I existed for a time in the hierarchical structure of academia. I entered goal-oriented environments driven by strategic plans and measurable outcomes. The outline direction was up. Now, while there is practicality and useful with all of this, there was an inverse relationship between how much I worked and how much I played. I lost for a time an essential curiosity. There was a 5-year period where I stopped being creative. No sketchbook, no notebook. I don't think that it is coincidence that I began keeping a notebook again in tandem with discovering meditation and my pull towards creative writing. Both are practices dedicated to looking inward to take the internal insights gained and offer them back out to the world. I seem to face over and over again a tension between a more linear path in professions that pay and the path of heart, that of art, making, contemplation, and spiritual questions. When I started keeping a writing notebook again at the start of my master's, the impact of following lines was evidenced in how my doodles changed. Jordan, if you don't mind going back a couple of slides, that'd be great. When the page most readily available to me was no longer the blank page of a sketchbook, but the line page of a journal, the organic, edgeless shape of a circle no longer seemed to fit. I still doodled with the same basic principles I'd originally adopted, a repeated shape working with the contrast of black and white, trying to push what I could do with lines and dots. And then if you go to the next slide, trying to see what I could do without lines and dots with just the basic shape and the color. But a different shape emerged, which you guys can see is the triangle, because it fit within the invisible imposed grid. It seemed that the container mattered. So Jordan, you can skip ahead a bunch of slides to the one about the church labyrinth. One of the church labyrinths that survived is located in the Chartres Cathedral in France. Outlined in stone on the cathedral floor, the labyrinth has several distinct features. So you can see that at the center of the labyrinth is a 6-petaled flower or rose that represents the Virgin Mary, the Mother of God, or the feminine aspect. Helen Sands writes that in the images of flower and path, the masculine and feminine traditions are united. Pilgrims tread the pathway with Christ, yet their journey is also held and sustained by the feminine, by Mary, his mother, mystic rose of the petaled center. In this crucible, where masculine and feminine are in balance and where love moves, transformation and healing can take place. Another distinction of this labyrinth are the lunations, the ring of partial circles that add fluorescent detail to the outer rim of the labyrinth. The lunations consist of 28 2/3 circles, known as foils, and 28 points called cusps per quadrant. These are believed to offer a method to track the lunar cycle, another gesture towards the feminine rhythm. Sands writes that in the 21st century, we need to strike a balance between the masculine reason and the feminine intuition. Linear thinking and excessive materialism are not compatible with the survival of Earth. The labyrinth balances opposites and brings relief to the deep spiritual drought of our times. Its path is curved, expressing the feminine, whereas the fixed turning points where movement almost stops, the masculine. Here we experience as two forces working in harmony, which can be deeply satisfying and healing. Now, because my doodles seem to be guided by similar principles, from time to time, I Google images of Zentangles. Now, for those who missed the Zentangle fad, the Zentangle method combines a series of simple shapes or elemental strokes, dots, lines, simple curves, S-curves, and orbs to create larger patterns or tiles. Zentangles are non-representational and unplanned, so you can focus on each stroke without worry of the result, not unlike traveling a labyrinth. Once, while looking for a line and pattern inspiration, I chanced on an image of a spiral and an accompanying instruction. If you have a pen and paper, you can do this now. In the middle of the page, start drawing a spiral with a tight center. From this loop center, as you move outward, follow the path of the line exactly without lifting your pen or turning the page. Perhaps I'll just pause here for a minute so that everybody can give it a try. Okay, Jordan, if you want to click to the next slide. So when I did this, imperfection quickly emerged. Even though I've done this many, many times, if you go to the next slide, you can see just how many spirals I have drawn over time. Creating a perfect spiral is impossible. The variation in the circular path remained slight in the smaller loops at the spiral center, but soon became exaggerated and apparent as the loops widened. Because the task was to follow the path of the line exactly, there was no way to course correct, no way to repair the variation once the imperfection was introduced. The mistake, the deviation, however, was what has become interesting. I also noticed that the defined line of the spiral matched those of the lines of the page, a bridge between the linear background and the organic curves imposed over it. That first spiral felt like a compromise, a union. At its simplest, the idea of the labyrinth is that by walking the labyrinth's path, the physical movement towards the labyrinth center is echoed by inward movement to the deeper center inside each of us, where we are whole and intact even if we are suffering. The path of the labyrinth journey, therefore, takes us on an inner journey of healing towards personal well-being and newness of spirit. One author said that labyrinths help return us to the wisdom of image, the wisdom of doodles. It wasn't just because I found the spirals interesting that I abandoned the gridded triangles. I found the spiral, the not yet known labyrinth, at one of my most challenging points navigating chronic migraine. At this stage, I traveled to the heart of the labyrinth to face the beast, but hadn't found my way back out again. With almost constant aura and visual impairment, my world, including the lines on the page, had lost their edges. I often could not grasp my thoughts long enough to journal and could no longer see the grid to place the triangles on when doodling. As someone who has had to face a lot of constraint and reconfiguration as a result of migraine, I have taken courage in an idea by a fellow writer, Esme Wong, who also navigates chronic illness. She says that those who navigate limitations must find the unexpected shape, the shape that our lives take when we realize the boundaries that exist around it. In the book, Labyrinths and Mazes, A Complete Guide to Magical Paths of the World, author Jeff Shawward educates that labyrinth revivals occur when cultures are redefining themselves, when, in realizing the boundaries around our lives collectively, we reconfigure and find a new shape. Labyrinths, which force constraint, help us to see those boundaries and reimagine what those limits mean through the many myths and metaphors associated with them. One myth, that of Theseus and the Minotaur, comes up again and again. The myth begins on the island of Crete, ruled by King Minos. Minos had been given a white bull from Poseidon, the god of the sea, for the purpose of sacrifice. Finding the bull too magnificent to kill, Minos kept the bull in his herd and sacrificed a lesser bull in its stead. Angered by this offense against him, Poseidon cursed Minos' wife, Pasiphae, to lust after and physically desire the bull. Unable to resist this pull, Pasiphae mated with the bull and became pregnant. She birthed the Minotaur, a creature with a man's body and a bull's head. Embarrassed and enraged by the visibility the Minotaur posed of his wife's infidelity, but unable to kill the Minotaur himself, King Minos commissioned Daedalus, a noted architect and creative, to construct a labyrinth in which to hold the Minotaur captive at its center. Now, in the way Greek myths are dramatic and have lots of pieces that are going on with them, while all this was unfolding, Androgenes, a son of King Minos, went to Athens to compete in the Pan-Athenic Games. And while participating in the marathon, he was killed by the very same bull that had impregnated his mother. Devastated, King Minos went to war with Athens and won. And as penance, he demanded that Aegeus, the ruler of Athens, send 7 men and women to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. Theseus, the son of Aegeus, volunteered to go as one of those to be sacrificed on behalf of Athens, but committed to slaying the Minotaur when he went. Aegeus tried to convince his son not to go, to no avail, and made Theseus promise that after his return from Crete, that he would fly a white sail if he had been successful and a black sail if he had been killed. When Theseus arrived in Crete, this wouldn't be a myth if there wasn't a love and romance. He met Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. Ariadne fell in love with Theseus. Knowing the complexity of the myth, knowing the complexity of the labyrinth, she knew that even if Theseus successfully killed the Minotaur, he would not ever be able to find his way out of the maze. So she vowed to help him as long as he promised to take her away with him if he survived. Ariadne gave Theseus a ball of golden thread to unravel behind him as he navigated towards the center of the labyrinth, so that he had something to find his pathway back out. Theseus was ultimately successful in slaying the Minotaur and found his way out of the labyrinth because of the thread that he'd been given. Together, he and Ariadne fled from Crete to the island of Naxos, where they celebrated their escape and union by dancing the crane dance, side to snake, like the serpentine path of the labyrinth. Legend says that after long hours of feasting and drinking, Ariadne fell asleep on the shore and failed to board the boat when it made its final leg to Athens. By the time Theseus figured out that Ariadne was not with them, it was too late. He was so upset that he forgot the promise he made to his father and did not change the sails from black to white. Therefore, upon seeing the ship arrive with the black sail, Aegeus threw himself into the sea in despair, causing Theseus to become the ruler of Athens on a foundation of grief. Now, in this myth, I see many historic and human themes: bargains between rulers, the desire to cling to that which is beautiful, broken agreements, infidelity, shame, dispute between nations, noble aspirations, the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the collective good, triumph, love and romance, aid, celebration, unexpected turns that lead to grief. All of this makes sense to me and seems like fodder to learn from. My rational mind, however, gets caught on a small inconsistency. If it was a labyrinth that housed the Minotaur, shouldn't it have been a unicursal path? Why did Theseus need Ariadne's string to find his way out? Helen Raphael Sands suggests that perhaps we have to interpret the story on a symbolic level. Underground in the dark womb-like labyrinth, the hero needs to hold the illuminating thread of the feminine to find his way from death to new life. What I read from this is that perhaps when facing challenges, we are short-sighted. Whereas we might think that the hard part is the hero's journey in and their effort facing the beast, Labyrinths and Ariadne's string teach us that we cannot neglect the journey out or underestimate how tricky it can be to integrate what was learned in facing our core and navigating our return home. Grief found Theseus because on his way back from the heroic journey, he forgot his promises to take Ariadne with him and to change the sail. To test the difference between the path from the outside in compared to the inside out, I returned to doodling. I drew some spirals, starting with a wide outer arc, again trying to follow the path exactly until it reached the center. What I discovered was that the inconsistency still emerged, but that it was less apparent, hidden by the initial smooth arcs of the outer ring. On the path inward to facing our challenges, our blind spots, the imperfections with our worldview, or the structure of our relationships and society, our individual and collective trauma are hidden. It is only on the way out, after having faced reality in the center and gained insight, that those inconsistencies can be revealed, becoming ever more evident as our perspective widens. This is where the healing happens. After we have dared to recognize our constraints, been disoriented on the pathway in, and returned to the world willing to honor our promises, open to the unexpected shape waiting to emerge. So I'm going to just play a YouTube video. It's called The Cranes Dance. So it's an instrumental piece that is based off of the dance in the myth, the Cranes Dance, that Theseus and Ariadne danced in celebration. And like I said, it's all instrumental. It's about 3 minutes long. So you can take this as an opportunity to do some doodling or do some quiet reflection, just let the words settle. So here it is. Can you all hear that okay?
Oh, we just lost it.
Oh, can
There
you
it is
hear
again.
Okay. So to close, before we extinguish our chalice, we just have one more responsive reading. And let's see here. Is anyone willing to read the all capital letters? So we can have multiple voices. Marianne, you volunteered the last time I saw your hand. Would you mind reading the all capitals and I can read the regular text? Don't forget to unmute yourself. All right, you're kicking us off because we start with all caps.
These things will never change.
The voice of forest water in the night, a woman's laughter in the dark, the clean, hard rattle of raked gravel, the cricketing stitch of midday in hot meadows, the delicate web of children's voices in bright air.
I'm confused. I'm sorry. I don't know where you are. Right.
I had to paste it in 2 parts because it was too long. Do you want? I can just read those parts if that will be.
Oh, I see. Okay. These things will never change.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
The glitter of sunlight on roughened water, the glory of the stars, the innocence of morning, the smell of the sea in harbors.
These things will always be the same.
The feathery blur and smoky buddings of young boughs, and something there that comes and goes and can never be captured, the thorn of spring, the sharp and tongueless cry.
These things will never change.
The leaf, the blade, the flower, the wind that cries and sleeps and wakes again, the trees whose stiff arms clash and tremble in the dark, and the dust of lovers long since buried in the earth.
All things belonging to the earth will never change.
All things proceeding from the earth to seasons, all things that lapse and change and come again upon the earth. These come up from the earth that never changes. They go back into the earth that lasts forever.
Only the earth endures, but it endures forever.
The tarantula, the adder, the asp, I think that should say alder, and the aspen will also never change.
Pain and death will always be the same.
But under the pavements trembling like a pulse, under the buildings trembling like a cry, under the waste of time, under the hoof of the beasts above the broken bones of cities, there will be something growing like a flower.
Something bursting from the earth again, forever deathless, faithful, coming into life again.
Thank you, Mary Ann.
You're welcome, Emerson.
So with that, we'll go ahead and extinguish our chalice. And Jordan pasted the words in the chat if you would like to say them along with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of love, or the fire of courage and commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. And as we do, we'll have a period of virtual coffee hour for more conversation.